Picture the year 1854. Europe is, well, it's basically consumed by the Crimean War.
Yeah, completely engulfed.
Right. And at the same time, global markets are teetering right on the edge of this massive, unprecedented crash.
Which nobody really saw coming.
Exactly. But in the middle of all this chaos, there are these two men sitting in, the smog-choked cities of London and Manchester.
Just desperately trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah, and they aren't just doing this for themselves either. They're actually piecing together this entire geopolitical puzzle for readers all the way across the Atlantic Ocean.
It is an incredible image when you really visualize it. I mean, two political exiles, right? Surrounded by just these towering stacks of newspapers.
Oh, I can only imagine the mess.
Right, just piles of parliamentary reports and, heavily delayed military dispatches.
Yeah, they were effectively operating as a two-man intelligence agency.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And this was during one of the most volatile periods of the 19th century.
So the sources we are diving into today capture this dynamic perfectly. We're unpacking volume 13 of the Marx and Engels collected works.
Which is a very specific window of time.
Right. It covers exactly February 1854 to February 1855. So our mission on this deep dive is to explore how Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels functioned, not just as the abstract political theorists we usually think of.
Yeah, we're looking at them as 19th century investigative journalists.
Exactly. And foreign correspondents. We're going to uncover their real-time analyses of military strategy, diplomatic hypocrisy, and global economics.
The whole picture.
The whole picture, yeah.
Yeah.
And more importantly, we are going to look at the actual mechanics of how they did this, like how they connected these daily breaking news events to their broader theories of society and revolution.
Which is fascinating, considering the tools they had at the time.
Oh, absolutely. Now, before we get into the mechanics of their work, I do need to make a very clear statement to you, our listener.
Yeah, this is important.
The sources we are diving into today contain highly charged political and revolutionary ideas. So we are not taking sides, we aren't endorsing, and we aren't condemning any of these viewpoints.
Right, that's not what we're doing here.
Not at all. Our mission on this deep dive is strictly to unpack and understand the ideas exactly as they are presented in the historical source material. We are just here to analyze the text, the context, and, the mechanics of their arguments.
That really is the only way to approach this material. I mean, to genuinely understand their analysis of 1854, we have to look at it objectively.
Right.
We have to analyze what they said and why they said it, completely within the constraints of their era.
So to understand what they were writing about the Crimean War and the global autonomy, we first need to understand how they were writing it, because they weren't, sitting in some ivory tower casually pondering the abstract nature of capital.
Oh, no, not at all. They were hustling.
Yeah, they were grinding out copy to meet just brutal newspaper deadlines.
And we really have to root that hustle in the political climate of the early 1850s. Like, if we rewind just a few years to 1848 and 1849.
The year of revolution, right?
Exactly. Europe was just engulfed in revolutions. From Paris to Berlin to Vienna, people were on the barricades. They were demanding democratic rights, constitutions.
And in some places, socialist republics. Really.
Yeah, in some cases.
Yeah.
But by 1850, those revolutions they had categorically failed.
Just completely crushed.
Completely. The old monarchies and aristocracies roared right back to power. So what followed was this period of deep, suffocating political reaction.
Which essentially means the crackdown was total.
Total. I mean, radical publications were banned, censorship was rampant across the whole continent,
right?
And revolutionaries were either thrown in prison or, forced into exile. So Marx and Engels found themselves living in England. And the avenues they previously used to reach the public, like the radical papers they edited in Germany, those were completely shut down.
Which forces them to turn to journalism in a very, very different way.
Yeah, they had to adapt.
So during this specific period of 1854 to 1855, they were writing primarily for the New York Daily Tribune.
Which is a huge detail.
It is, because the Tribune wasn't some underground, secretly circulated pamphlet.
Right, it wasn't a zine?
No, it was one of the most widely read, mainstream, bourgeois American newspapers of its day. I mean, it boasted a readership of around 200,000 subscribers.
Which in the 1850s is just massive. It's a huge reach.
Yeah. And they were also writing for the German Neue Oder Zeitung and the Chartist People's paper in Britain.
It's worth pausing on the Chartist movement for a second just to contextualize that.
Yeah.
Because it shows they did keep one foot in the working class movement.
Oh, good point. So what was Chartism exactly?
Well, Chartism was this massive working class movement in Britain. They were demanding things like universal male suffrage, secret ballots, And this was a big one, an end to property qualifications for parliament.
So basic democratic rights that didn't exist yet.
Exactly. And Marx and Engels maintained ties with Chartist leaders like Ernest Jones, and they wrote for their paper. But you're absolutely right. The New York Daily Tribune was their main gig.
It was their financial lifeline.
Totally. It was how they paid the rent.
And the dynamic between the two of them is what gets me. Because Marx was the official correspondent, right? His name was on the Tribune payroll.
Yes, officially.
But Engels was frequently the one actually writing the articles, especially anything involving military analysis.
Yeah, Marx would get completely bogged down.
Right. Marx would be buried in economic research at the British Museum Reading Room in London, and he would literally write to Engels, who was up working at his family's textile firm in Manchester, basically saying, I'm completely stuck. I need you to write an article for the Tribune by Thursday.
It's so relatable. Please do my homework.
Please hit this deadline for me. And Engels would somehow just deliver these incredibly incisive pieces on deadline.
It really highlights a remarkable intellectual partnership. But, we shouldn't let the freelance nature of the work diminish the staggering rigor they applied to it.
Right. They weren't just phoning it in.
Not at all. When an event happened, they didn't just dash off an opinion piece based on whatever wire reports they read that morning over coffee. Their methodology required this intense historical excavation.
Okay, the perfect example of this is the summer of 1854.
Oh, the Spain stuff.
Yes. A revolution breaks out in Spain. Now, this is often referred to in Marxist terms as a quote-unquote bourgeois revolution. Before we get into what Marx actually did, let's clarify that term for the listener.
Yeah, we should define that.
So when they say bourgeois revolution here, they mean a revolution aimed at overthrowing absolute monarchy or feudal remnants, establishing constitutional limits, and basically creating a state that favors capitalist development.
Right.
Rather than a proletarian or working class revolution aiming for socialism.
Correct. So Spain in 1854 was experiencing this military uprising, and it was backed by popular insurrections in the cities. They were demanding constitutional reform against a deeply corrupt monarchy.
It's a big deal.
A very big deal. And when this news hits London, Marx's response is just extraordinary. He doesn't just read the immediate dispatches from Madrid. He realizes he cannot analyze this present moment without understanding the deep structural forces of Spanish history.
So what does he do? He literally teaches himself the Spanish language.
Which is insane, just for an article.
Just to write an article. He learns Spanish, and then he dives into the deep history of Spain's previous uprisings. Specifically, he maps out the insurrections of 1808, 1820, and 1843.
Because he wanted to understand the specific role of the Spanish military.
Right, and the fragmented nature of Spanish provincial politics, and how different classes interacted during those past crises. He ends up filling 5 entire notebooks with excerpts, historical data, and analysis just to prepare for writing his Revolutionary Spain series for the Tribune.
I mean, he was reading classical Spanish literature just to grasp the cultural context.
It's just wild.
But it speaks to a fundamental principle of their worldview. You cannot understand a surface-level political event without understanding the historical and economic roots that produced it.
Yeah, it doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Exactly. Marx's notebooks on Spain prove he wasn't just looking for hot takes to sell papers. He was hunting for the underlying laws of social development. So he saw the Spanish Revolution not as an isolated incident, but as a really complex interplay of a decayed absolute monarchy, a politically ambitious army, and an impoverished peasantry.
Wait, I need to interrupt this thought because
Yeah.
there's a massive contradiction here that we just can't ignore.
Okay, what is it?
If Marx and Engels' ultimate goal was a working-class revolution and the total overthrow of capitalism, why are they spending such intense effort generating content for a mainstream capitalist American newspaper?
That is the big question.
Right. Horace Greeley, the editor of the Tribune, was a major capitalist figure. So weren't Marx and Engels basically generating ad revenue for the enemy? How did they justify taking Yankee capitalist money to fund their lives?
That is the central paradox of their situation in the 1850s. And honestly, it's something they really grappled with. But the reality of their exile was harsh. They were broke.
I needed to survive.
Exactly. They needed to feed their families. But ideologically, they saw this as a tactical compromise for strategic gain. Like we talked about, in the repressive climate of post-1848 Europe, the Tribune was practically their only viable conduit to a broad, democratically inclined public.
So it's basically a Trojan horse strategy.
Exactly that. They didn't view it as selling out. They viewed it as utilizing the enemy's platform, a platform funded by bourgeois capital, to spread their own structural critiques of that very system to hundreds of thousands of readers.
That's actually pretty brilliant.
Right. They were writing about the brutalities of British colonialism in India, or the structural flaws of European diplomacy, and delivering those Marxist critiques straight to the breakfast tables of the American middle class.
Just sneaking it right in there next to the local news.
Yep. They believed they were exposing the irreconcilable contradictions of the era, and they were using the mass media of the day as their megaphone.
Okay, that definitely clarifies the how and the why of their journalism.
Yeah.
So let's pivot to the actual content they were producing with this massive megaphone.
Let's do it.
Because the biggest story they covered in 1854, the one that really dominates Volume 13, is the Crimean War.
Oh, yeah.
This was a sprawling, brutal conflict. It pitted an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire against the Russian Empire.
And to decipher their coverage of the Crimean War, we first have to establish their view of Tsarist Russia, because it dictates literally everything else.
How so?
Well, for Marx and Engels, Tsarist Russia was not just another country on the map. It was the ultimate, quote, bulwark of feudal absolutist reaction in Europe. It was the geopolitical enforcer of conservative aristocratic power.
The gendarme of Europe.
Precisely. They fundamentally believed that the collapse of the Russian autocracy was the essential precondition for any successful democratic or working-class revolution in Europe.
Because the Tsar would just crush it.
Right, and they had seen this play out in real time. Back in 1849, when the Hungarian Revolution was actually on the verge of defeating the Austrian Empire.
Which would have been huge.
It would have changed everything.
Yeah.
But the Russian Tsar just sent hundreds of thousands of troops across the border to crush the Hungarians and restore conservative rule.
Wow.
So they knew, as long as the Tsar had a massive army ready to march into Europe to crush uprisings, revolution in the West would always be under an existential threat.
So, following that logic, you would naturally assume Marx and Engels would be loudly cheering on the Western Allies, right? Because Britain and France were fighting Russia, they should be the heroes of the story.
You would think so.
But reading the sources, they fiercely criticize the Western powers. They basically argue that Britain, France, and even quote-unquote neutral powers like Austria and Prussia secretly shared Russia's counter-revolutionary goals.
Yeah, because Marx and Engels saw right through the public rhetoric.
What was the rhetoric?
Well, the British and French governments were selling the war to their publics as this great moral crusade, defending liberty and civilization against Eastern despotism.
Classic wartime propaganda.
Exactly. But Marx and Engels argued that the Western powers didn't actually want to destroy Tsarism. The British and French aristocracies and ruling classes were just as terrified of a genuine popular revolution sweeping Europe as the Tsar was.
Right, because if you completely destroy the Tsar, you remove the safety net for conservative power everywhere.
Exactly. The Western allies merely wanted to check Russia's expansion in the Near East. The Ottoman Empire, what they called the sick man of Europe, was crumbling.
Falling apart.
Yeah. And Russia wanted to carve it up. They wanted to secure warm water ports in the Black Sea and get access to the Mediterranean.
Which Britain obviously wouldn't like.
No, Britain wanted to stop this to protect its own naval dominance and its crucial trade routes to India and France. France was just looking for prestige and influence in the Middle East.
So it wasn't about liberty at all.
Not even a little bit. It was an imperial turf war. They wanted to maintain the geopolitical balance of power, secure their own colonial influence over Turkey, and push Russia back just a few inches without actually toppling the Romanov dynasty.
There is a brilliant, just biting quote from Marx in the text that summarizes this imperial hypocrisy perfectly.
Oh, I think I know the one.
He read that, quote, "Her Majesty's government would be as ready to swallow the Grand Turk as his Cossack Majesty."
Meaning the Sultan and the Tsar.
Exactly. It exposes the whole moral crusade as just naked imperial interest. They'd conquer Turkey just as fast as Russia would if they could get away with it.
And, their critique of France was equally, if not more, scathing.
Let's talk about France.
So, France was ruled by Louis Napoleon, who crowned himself Napoleon III after a coup in 1851. This is where the term Bonapartist France comes from.
And Marx and Engels hated him.
Despised him. They viewed Bonapartism as a highly corrupt system where a dictator rules by playing different social classes against each other. He relied heavily on the military and the state bureaucracy just to maintain order.
And how did that domestic setup impact their foreign policy in the Crimea?
Marx pointed out that Napoleon III was using the Crimean War purely as a theatrical distraction.
Smoke and mirrors.
Basically. His domestic regime was shaky, it was illegitimate, and it was built on a mountain of debt. He needed military glory to justify his rule to the French public and to keep the army loyal. As Marx noted, Bonaparte had no alternative but revolution at home or war abroad.
Wow.
Furthermore, Marx and Engels tracked how the Bonapartist clique in Paris was using all the massive military contracts and war expenditures to embezzle public funds.
Oh, so they were getting rich off it too.
Hugely rich, playing the stock exchange. The war wasn't an ideological struggle for liberty, it was a domestic survival strategy and a massive grift for the French leadership.
Wait, I need to pause on that because this creates a really unsettling paradox.
Okay, let's hear it.
If Britain and France were fighting a limited, cynical war just to protect their own imperial interests, and Marx and Engels criticized them for it, does that mean Marx and Engels actually wanted a bigger, more devastating war than the Allies did?
Yeah, it does.
Were they actively hoping the conflict would escalate? Because that sounds incredibly reckless.
It sounds shocking to modern ears, absolutely.
Yeah.
But we have to understand the revolutionary logic in the context of the 19th century. Yes, they advocated for a full-scale, all-out revolutionary war against Tsarism.
So they wanted it to go all the way.
They didn't want the localized, contained conflict the diplomats were trying to manage. They believed that a massive European conflagration against Russia would accomplish two crucial things.
What were they?
First, it would shatter the Russian Empire from the outside, destroying the ultimate backstop of European conservatism. This would lead to the liberation of oppressed nationalities, like the Poles, the Hungarians, the Italians, who were all subjugated by the Tsar and his ally, the Austrian Emperor.
Okay, that's one. What's the second?
Second, and crucially, an all-out war would demand immense sacrifices from the British and French working classes. Marx and Engels theorized that as the war dragged on and as the incompetence of the aristocratic governments became unbearable, the strain would stretch the regimes in London and Paris to their breaking points.
Ah, yes,
It
yes.
would potentially spark a revolution from within.
So they were hoping a continental war would essentially act as an incubator for a continental revolution.
Yes. They exposed the actual Crimean conflict as a mock or sham war. I mean, they spent pages and pages dissecting the diplomatic conferences in Vienna.
Right, because there were all these peace talks happening simultaneously.
Exactly. And showing how the diplomats stalled, drafted these totally meaningless treaties, played semantic games, all trying to find a way to end the war without fundamentally changing the map of Europe.
While tens of thousands of soldiers were dying in the mud.
Exactly. Just awful hypocrisy.
And that diplomatic hypocrisy, the desire to fight a sham war without unleashing the total force necessary for actual victory, that translated directly into how the war was actually fought on the ground.
Oh, absolutely.
Which brings us to the most fascinating part of Volume 13 for me, Engels' role as a military analyst. Because while the diplomats were playing semantic games in Vienna, the soldiers were dying of cholera in the trenches. And Engels was watching all of it like a hawk from his desk in Manchester.
Engels was essentially operating as a one-man open-source intelligence agency.
It's so cool.
It is. We use the term OSINT today, and that is exactly what he was doing in 1854. He immersed himself in military science. He would cross-reference the Times of London, French military dispatches, Russian bulletins, and independent letters from the front.
He wasn't just tracking where the armies were on a map either. He analyzed them down to the most granular structural details. Like he looked at their tactical formations, the range of their rifles, the cut of their uniforms.
Yes, the uniforms.
And crucially, their commissariats, like the logistical supply chains that fed and armed them.
And his conclusions regarding the Western Allies were brutal. He exposed the gross incompetence of the British and French commands. He explicitly called the British generals strategical mediocrities.
Ouch.
Yeah, but his critique wasn't just that they were bad at their jobs. His critique was structural. He pointed out that the British military command was a direct reflection of the British political oligarchy.
Right, because of the system of purchasing commissions. Can you explain how that worked? Because to anyone listening today, it sounds insane.
Oh, it's completely wild. In the British Army at that time, officers literally bought their ranks.
You just bought it.
You just bought it. You didn't become a colonel just by being a brilliant tactician. You bought the commission if you had enough aristocratic wealth. So top military jobs were given to aristocratic place hunters who were, as Engels scathingly put it, destitute even of elementary professional knowledge.
So you have guys leading armies who have no idea what they're doing.
None. The British Army hadn't fought a major European land war since Waterloo in 1815. They were attempting to fight a modern industrializing war using a medieval aristocratic command structure.
And the human cost of that structural flaw was catastrophic. I mean, this incompetence led to tragic, entirely needless casualties. When we talk about the Crimean War, we aren't just talking about battlefield deaths, right?
No, not at all.
The overwhelming majority of casualties were from disease and exposure. Engels tracked how troops were landed in Varna, which is in modern-day Bulgaria, without proper tents or medical supplies.
Just drop there.
Yeah, leading to thousands dying of cholera before they even saw a Russian soldier. And then, when they finally moved to the Crimea, the logistics were a total joke. Ships arrived with cargoes of entirely left boots.
Just left boots. It's almost comical if it wasn't so tragic.
Right. Soldiers literally froze to death in the winter of 1854 because the supply lines from the port of Balaclava to the siege lines, which were just a few miles away, completely broke down.
Because they lacked paved roads and basic transport.
Exactly. So Engels documented all of this, proving that the logistical failures were the direct result of a corrupt, archaic system of aristocratic privilege.
But, he was objective enough to analyze the Russian side with the exact same rigorous structural lens.
It's an important point.
Yeah, he didn't let his political hatred of the Tsar cloud his military analysis. He actually praised the raw heroism, the physical endurance, and the stubbornness of the Russian soldiers. However, he ruthlessly condemned the parade drill backwardness of the Russian army.
What does he mean by parade drill backwardness?
Well, he recognized that the Russian army was basically composed of serfs, peasants who were practically owned by their landlords.
Right, forced conscripts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they were commanded by a rigid, inflexible autocracy. So an army of serfs can be incredibly brave when defending a fixed position, but they completely lack the initiative, the modern tactical flexibility, and the independent decision-making of an army composed of free citizens.
So they couldn't adapt on the fly.
No, they were trained for rigid parade ground maneuvers, not the dynamic skirmishing required by modern rifles.
This analytical method gave Engels a predictive accuracy that is genuinely stunning. I mean, he correctly mapped out Russian strategic maneuvers in the Danubian principalities before they even happened.
He saw it coming.
He really did. He highlighted that the siege of Sevastopol would be the defining, unparalleled center of gravity for the entire war, long before the mainstream press got on. But my absolute favorite example of his OSINT work is how he brilliantly debunked a massive piece of fake news in real time.
The Sevastopol hoax of September 1854.
Yes. Let's get into the mechanics of this, because it shows exactly how he worked.
It's a great story.
So, in late September 1854, a rumor started by a Todar messenger spreads like wildfire across Europe. The British and French press enthusiastically report that the massive Russian fortress of Sevastopol has fallen to the Allies after a brief battle.
And everyone just buys it.
Completely. There are celebrations in London and Paris. The stock markets react. It is treated as established, indisputable fact.
And Engels, sitting at his desk in Manchester, looks at the reports and immediately says, no. This is physically impossible.
How exactly did he debunk a hoax, just using delayed mail and newspapers while the rest of the world believed it?
Math and logistics.
Just pure math.
Yep. Engels knew the exact date the Allied armies landed in the Crimea and began marching south from the Alma River. He knew the average marching speed of an army carrying its equipment.
Okay.
He knew the size of the Russian garrison inside Sevastopol. But most importantly, he knew that to breach a major fortress like Sevastopol, you need heavy siege artillery.
You can't just knock on the door.
Right, you need massive guns. He tracked the shipping manifests and knew the heavy siege guns hadn't even been fully unloaded from the transport ships at Balaclava yet.
Wow.
Let alone dragged miles overland to the front lines. So, by calculating the troop movements, the supply tonnage, and factoring in the telegraph delays across Europe, he wrote an article for the Tribune categorically stating the math didn't work.
So he just did the arithmetic.
Yeah, he proved the city could not have fallen.
And he was entirely right. The siege ended up lasting for nearly a year. It's a total masterclass in separating data from propaganda. But this raises a deeper question. If we pull back from the specific battles, how does Engels connect the shape of a cavalry charge or the design of a supply wagon to a communist theory of history? Like, why does he care so much about this?
Because Engels was pioneering a groundbreaking sociological theory of warfare. He argued that a country's military potential, its tactical maneuverability, and the very way its soldiers fight on the battlefield are strictly and inextricably dependent on its level of industrial development and its socioeconomic structure.
You cannot divorce the army from the society that produces it.
Exactly. So the rigid, inflexible line formations of the Russian army mirrored the rigid, inflexible serf economy of Russia.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
And the logistical disasters of the British army mirrored the archaic, aristocratic corruption of the British political class. Now, France had better logistics and more merit-based officers because they were a more developed bourgeois state, but they were hampered by the corruption of the Bonapartist clique at the very top.
So for Engels, the battlefield is basically just a mirror of the economy.
Yes. The way a society fights is completely dictated by the way a society produces.
The battlefield is a mirror of the economy. If that is true, if the military truly reflects the economic base, then we absolutely must look at what Marx was discovering about the global markets during this exact same period.
Because he was busy.
Very busy, because while Engels was analyzing trenches and artillery trajectories, Marx was obsessively analyzing global trade and ledger books.
The two analyses are really just two sides of the same coin. Volume 13 shows Marx tracking the early, rumbling symptoms of a massive economic crisis.
And this wasn't just a local downturn.
No, this crisis was brewing globally and would eventually detonate a few years later in the Panic of 1857, which economic historians widely consider the first truly worldwide economic crisis. But here in 1854, Marx is already seeing the fault lines forming beneath the surface of the economic moon.
How was he doing this? I mean, he was essentially functioning as a forensic financial analyst, right?
Very much so.
He studied The Economist magazine religiously. He pored over British parliamentary reports on trade. And he compiled this massive, incredibly detailed notebook titled Money Credit Crises. So what specific economic indicators was he tracking to predict this crash?
He was tracking the data points of what he called the fatal working of the English industrial system. So he looked at the massive overproduction in British factories, particularly the cotton mills.
Okay, so they're making too much cotton.
Way too much. British industry was producing goods at a rate far, far exceeding what the domestic market could absorb or actually afford to buy.
So they have warehouses full of cotton and nobody at home to buy it. What do?
Well, they have to dump it abroad. They flood markets in India, America, and Australia with British goods. But to finance this massive expansion and export drive, the entire system relied on an intricate, highly fragile web of credit and bills of exchange.
So built on debt.
Exactly. Capitalists were aggressively over-speculating abroad, just searching desperately for new markets to absorb all their surplus capital.
And Marx was specifically looking at the railroad boom in the United States, right?
Yes, that was a huge indicator for him. British capital was just pouring into American railway construction. Marx traced the domino effect. British factories overproduce, they rely on credit to survive. Banks loan money for speculative ventures like American railroads, assuming those railroads will immediately open new markets and generate massive returns.
Which they didn't.
Right. Marx understood that when those speculative bubbles burst, like when the American railroads didn't yield immediate profits or when the Asian markets became saturated, the credit chain would just snap.
And then the dominoes fall backward.
Exactly. The shockwaves would travel back across the Atlantic, directly crashing into the banks in London, causing a suspension of payments, bankruptcies, and mass unemployment.
He wasn't just tracking a random series of unfortunate financial accidents then. He was identifying the structural mechanism of the boom and bust cycle inherent to capitalism.
Yes, the built-in flaw.
And here is where Marx takes it a step further, connecting the ledger books directly back to the political drama playing out in London. He saw this creeping economic decay as intrinsically linked to the decay of British politics.
This is such a fascinating part of his analysis.
He argued that the traditional, celebrated two-party system in Britain, the Whigs and the Tories, was fundamentally breaking down.
Yeah, let's get some context for that, because traditionally the Tories represented the old, conservative, landed aristocracy, like the country gentlemen. The Whigs represented a mix of liberal aristocrats and the newly wealthy industrial bourgeoisie.
So they were originally distinct groups.
Right. But Marx argued that by the 1850s, they were no longer real parties representing distinct, opposing ideological visions or even distinct economic classes.
Why? What changed?
The economic base had changed. The old landed aristocracy and the new industrial bourgeoisie were increasingly merging their interests. They were investing in the same colonial ventures, the same American railway.
Oh, see.
Because their economic interests had merged into this broad elite consensus, their political representatives degenerated. Marx argued they were no longer parties, but mere coteries or cliques. They were driven entirely by, personal whims and vanities, and the desire for government patronage rather than any substantive policy differences.
I want to try an analogy here to see if I have this right. It's like looking at two rival sports teams that happen to be owned by the exact same corporate holding company.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Like on the field, the players are fighting fiercely, the fans in the stands are screaming at each other, and the media treats the rivalry as life or death. But if you look at the ledger books, the ticket sales and the television revenue from both teams are flowing upward into the exact same bank account. The rivalry is performative, the financial reality is a monopoly.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. Marx was basically exposing the theatrical nature of parliamentary politics. I mean, he wrote extensively about Lord Palmerston and the coalition governments of the era, showing how they simply argued over the spoils of office, who gets to be a minister, who gets which contract, while representing the exact same underlying class interests.
The real power wasn't in Parliament.
No, the real power didn't lie in the parliamentary debates. It lay in the economic base, in the City of London, and in the factories of Manchester.
So if we synthesize Marx's economic analysis of impending financial ruin with Engels' military analysis of the disastrous Crimean War, we arrive at their ultimate driving hope for this entire era. They weren't just analyzing this data to be the smartest guys in the room. They were looking for the spark.
Exactly. This is really the culmination of Volume 13. They theorized that the combination of a draining, spectacularly mismanaged, and deeply unpopular war in the Crimea, converging simultaneously with an impending, devastating global economic crash, would create the perfect storm.
The perfect storm. So the war strains the political legitimacy of the state, exposing the incompetence of the ruling class,
Right.
while the economic crash destroys the living standards of the working class, removing their complacency.
Yes. Together, these factors would create the precise material conditions required to ignite a new, unstoppable, revolutionary upsurge across Europe.
They thought this was it.
They did. They believed this perfect storm would finish the work that was left undone in 1848, sweeping away both the Russian autocracy and the capitalist systems of the West. They were sitting in the middle of 1854, watching the logistical collapse in the Black Sea and the reckless overspeculation in the City of London, and thinking, the system is tearing itself apart. The crisis is coming.
They were reading the structural weaknesses of global capitalism and European autocracy in real time, just using the daily news as their raw data set. It's incredible.
It really is unparalleled analysis for the time.
So let's pull back to the surface and summarize this journey. We've explored how Marx and Engels utilized their positions as journalists in 1854 and 1855, primarily for the New York Daily Tribune. We've seen that they didn't just write superficial opinion pieces. They dissected the geopolitics of the Crimean War to expose diplomatic hypocrisy and the sham war of the imperial powers.
All while hiding it in plain sight.
Exactly. And we've seen Engels pioneer a completely new kind of open-source socio-military analysis where the logistics and tactics of an army reflect its underlying economy, debunking fake news with pure math along the way.
My favorite part.
It's so good. And we've seen Marx deep in the financial data, tracking overproduction and the decay of the two-party system to predict a global economic crisis. And they did all of this while teaching themselves new languages, digging through raw historical data, and grinding out weekly deadlines in exile.
It truly is a masterclass in applying a rigorous theoretical framework to the chaotic daily flow of world events. They refuse to be distracted by the surface noise of diplomacy or the theatrical parliamentary debates. They were always looking deeper, just searching for the structural, economic, and historical forces driving history forward.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to chew on. Imagine if Marx and Engels were alive today, scrolling through our morning news feeds or watching a 24-hour news network.
Oh man, they would have a field day.
Right. But they wouldn't be distracted by the daily political drama, the viral debate clips, or the diplomatic handshakes on the evening news.
No, they'd ignore all of that.
They would be looking directly at the global supply chains. They would be analyzing the logistical realities of modern conflicts, totally ignoring the press briefings. They would be digging into the raw economic data, the corporate portfolios, and the holding companies to find out what is actually happening beneath the surface of the political theater.
That's where the real story always is.
So the next time you open a news app, ask yourself, how much of the news you consume today is just the sham war, the diplomatic theater, and the performative arguments of the political coteries, and how much of it is actually illuminating the underlying structural reality of the world you live in.
A great question to end on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.